Ja, hvis de sidste vil finde jeres pladser, så welcome all, and especially welcome to today's speaker, David Friedman. I've been looking very much forward to this presentation. Just a few words about our guest, who is a PhD in physics, a professor emeritus of economics from the University of Santa Clara, where you specialized in the economics law and legal systems and the economic analysis of law. Furthermore, not least, you're a very prolific and unconventional libertarian thinker. You have authored, I think, 9 books. 3 of them are novels, including The Machinery of Freedom, first published some 50 years ago in 1973, and actually expanded in 2 editions, following editions. So I don't know if the 9 count is really accurate, because it has been expanded quite a lot in both editions. You write a Substack, which is called David D. Friedman, Substack.com, and you run the webpage daviddfriedman.com, which where you can actually download most of your books and other writings for free. So I could recommend that. We're going to talk about the proper role of government today, and this is, of course, the subject. There's huge disagreements about between economists and political thinkers. However, there's almost universal agreement that government should at least provide public goods, because market failure prevents the markets from doing so. But there's not complete universal agreement, because actually you argue that the case for government intervention is much weaker than usually assumed. So welcome very much. Well, after the speech, there will be opportunity to ask questions, and I'll go around with a mic, and please wait for the mic. This is being taped. If you don't like to be taped, don't ask a question, but if you ask a question, I'll come around with a mic later on. But first, David Friedman.
My subject today is market failure. Like most technical terms, it doesn't mean like what it sounds as though it means like. And I'm going to argue that market failure is indeed an argument for government intervention in the economy, but that it is a stronger argument against government intervention in the economy. And hopefully I will be able to explain all of this. And the first step is to explain what market failure is, why it is an argument against laissez-faire, why more precisely it implies that laissez-faire will sometimes do the wrong thing, but why it is a stronger argument against the alternative to laissez-faire. We don't have the option of having a benevolent dictator, an omniscient benevolent dictator running our societies. We have to choose among the things we can actually implement. And the reason it is a stronger argument is that if you think through the logic of market failure, you realize that although it occurs on the private market, it occurs as the exception to the usual pattern, whereas it is the norm on the political market, that the conditions that lead to market failure occasionally exist on the private market, routinely exist on the public or political market. And I will then go on to point out that market failure not being really about either markets, public or private, but rather a general issue in human behavior and human coordination, is relevant to all sorts of other things, including marriage, teaching, war, and how to make money. Also the pandemic. Technical terms sound as though you can tell what they mean by their names, but you can't. I am sure there are many people in the world who believe that they know basically what the theory of relativity is. It's the theory that everything is relative. Of course, those of you who know something about the theory of relativity know that's not what it is. Indeed, the theory of relativity implies that the speed of light is quite impossibly absolute. That if light is going this way, it passes you with the same speed whether you're going this way or that way, which is obviously impossible, but turns out to be true. Similarly, market failure ought to mean situations where market fail, but in fact it doesn't. There are ways markets can fail which are not market failure, and market failure happens in many places other than markets. It is a general problem in the coordination of human activity. What is market failure? And I think the best way of thinking about it is that market failure is a situation where individual rationality does not lead to group rationality, where even if each individual correctly acts in his own interest, the group, perhaps even every individual in the group, is worse off than if they had all done something else. Why does that happen? It happens because my act helps me but harms you. Your act helps you but harms me. Consequently, even though each of us is being helped by his act, each of us is being harmed by the other person's act and thus worse off. My standard example that I like to start with is to imagine that you are one of 10,000 men. It's about 1,000 years ago, somewhere, could be pretty close to Norway actually, or Denmark. You are one of 10,000 men with spears, and you're standing in a line pointing your spears that way. And the reason is there are another 10,000 men on horseback with spears who are coming at you. And you do a very quick cost-benefit calculation. And you say, if we stand and keep our spears properly planted, with reasonable luck we can stop their charge. And some of us will get killed, but most of us will probably survive. If we run, horses run faster than we do. I should stand. I'm sorry, I made a mistake. I said we. I don't control him and him. If everybody else stands and I run, I'm one man out of 10,000. That'll have very little effect on our chance of breaking the charge, and I won't be one of the ones who gets killed. If everybody else runs and I stand, I'm dead. So if the rest are going to run, I'd better run faster. Whatever everybody else is doing, it is still in my private interest to run. The result is that we all run and most of us die. Welcome to the dark side of rationality. Let me give you a second example, and this is one I've actually observed, a more mundane one. When I was teaching at UCLA, just south of the campus, there is an intersection which the locals claimed at the time was the busiest intersection in the world. Whether that's true, I don't know. Wilshire and Westwood, I think. And what would you see happening? Traffic's going this way. The light goes red. Cars are trying to get across. And the result is that when the light goes red, this part of the intersection is filled with cars. They gradually filter out. They are, of course, blocking the cars going this way. They gradually filter out just in time for the cars here to go up, light goes red, and they jam that way. Everybody would get home faster if everybody politely waited to enter the intersection until he was sure he could get across it. But any individual driver who did that would get home later. All right, it's exactly the same logic. Let me give you another example, and this is one that you've probably observed. You're in a restaurant with friends, and one of the reasons you're in the restaurant with friends is you like to talk to each other. Unfortunately, other people in the restaurant like to talk too, and it's a little bit noisy, and so you can't quite hear your friends, so you've got to speak louder. Of course, everybody else in the restaurant also has to speak louder, and pretty soon you're all yelling and nobody can be heard. All right? It's exactly the same phenomenon. So this, I want to argue, is the essential nature of market failure and illustrates the fact that it's a problem that exists in lots and lots of different contexts. Why is it an argument against laissez-faire? To show that, let me start with what I think of as the simple argument for freedom. And the simple argument, oops, that was supposed to have, I went too far. The simple argument for freedom is that each person acts in his own interest. Each makes the decisions that maximize his net benefit, benefit minus cost. So that maximizes the sum net benefit for everyone, so there's no need for government to intervene to change what people do. And you can see already, I hope, what is wrong with that argument. And what is wrong with that argument is that sometimes I get the benefit of my act and you get the cost. Air pollution or dangerous driving would be examples. In that case, I might do it even though total cost is greater than benefit, cost to me plus you, but I only count the cost to me, making us on net worse off. These are what we call negative externalities. You can have the effect the other way. Sometimes I pay the cost and you get the benefit. Radio broadcast, basic research would be standard examples of that. Therefore, even though the benefit is larger than the cost, I might not do it and therefore miss an opportunity to make us on net better off. And this could be referred to as a positive externality, but more commonly as a public good problem. And the basic public good problem, I should say a public good does not mean a good produced by the public or for the public. This is another case where technical terms don't mean what they sound like. A public good is a good whose producer cannot control who gets it. There's a second condition usually included, but I'm not going to bother with it because it's not essential. And the fact that you can't control who gets the good means you can't charge people for it. And that means that even if the value to them of the good is much greater than the cost you of producing it, it's not worth producing, so it doesn't get produced. That's the essence of the public good problem. Now, sometimes public good problems can be solved by sufficient ingenuity, and similarly for externality problems. For example, one way of solving an externality problem is to make sure that the person creating it and the person who is receiving the externality are in some sense the same person, legally if not literally. So if you think about a shopping center, the person running the shopping center has an incentive to consider that a tenant who plays loud noise at times when people don't want loud noise is not a good tenant and should be stopped or removed. It may even occur to him that there is a positive externality to a late-night restaurant, to having a movie theater next to it, and a positive externality to a movie theater to having a late-night restaurant next to it, and may therefore arrange to rent to the appropriate tenants, thus collecting those externalities in the rent that he gets, because what he's producing is now more valuable to both renters. Furthermore, some public good problems can be dealt with by ingenuity. It's perfectly obvious to an economist that radio broadcasts never happened, because after all, a radio broadcast is a pure public good. You're spending time and money broadcasting it, running music, hiring people to talk on the broadcast or whatever, and then you have no control over who gets it. However, some unknown genius thought of the possibility of producing not one public good but two. One public good with a positive cost of production and a positive value to the consumer. One public good with a negative cost of production and a negative value to the consumer. Tie the two tightly together and give away the package. And of course, that means bundling an advertisement with a radio broadcast, because the advertisement has a negative cost of production to you because somebody will pay you to put it on. All right? So those are examples of cases where you can get around on the free market from these problems. The point, however, is that there is no guarantee that will always be possible. These are special cases where somebody can think up a ingenious solution, not as in we like to have in most of economics cases where you can say, well, this is going to happen because. Right? So the obvious implication, which lots of people and probably most economists have drawn, is that government could step in. It can improve the situation by regulating things that produce negative externalities, regulating air pollution and dangerous driving, which makes us all better off. And it can improve it by subsidizing radio, television, research, making us all better off by producing acts whose benefits are larger than their cost. That's the basic argument for government, as I think most economists mistakenly see it. But the problem with that argument is that for it to work, we need some mechanism that will make government do the right things. All right? When I'm saying government could, we need some, and the right way to think about government, just as the right way to think about the economy, is in terms of individual actors, each acting in his own interest. So we need some way that the rational choices of political actors, voters, politicians, lobbyists, judges, all the rest of them, will add up to rational choices for the whole polity. Failing that, government intervention might make things worse instead of better. That's the basic problem here. In order for this to work, we need some mechanism that, which brings us to, sorry, I was misreading my sequence on the slides, which brings us to the subject that I think of as market failure on the political market. Why does market failure occur? Because actors are not paying the costs of their actions or are not receiving the benefits. Most political decisions are made by people who neither pay the cost nor receive the benefit. A voter who bears the cost of making himself well-informed in order to vote for the right people is providing benefits, most of whom go to the other members of his population. The legislator who passes the bill is providing costs and benefits to other people. The lobbyist benefits his customers at the cost of others. And the judge makes decisions, sets precedents, almost all of whose costs and benefits are borne by others. Therefore, there is no reason to expect political actors to take those actions that minimize net benefits for all. And, for example, let me go into more detail. The rationally ignorant voter, you would think that when you call a voter ignorant, you're insulting him, but I'm not. On the contrary, I'm complimenting him for his rationality. In order for democracy to work, what I think of as the civic class model of democracy, which is the one where democracy works because if the politicians don't do the right things, we vote them out. For that to work, the voters must be well informed. For some odd reason, no politician ever runs as the bad guy. So the voter has to be able to distinguish the claims of the politicians, all of whom say they're good guys, and at least at a high level, all of whom are pretty competent at pretending to be good guys, and many of whom actually believe that they're good guys, which makes it even more persuasive. In order for that to work, you have to know. Information is costly. Well, that's all right. Lots of things are costly, but it's a cost for which you get no benefit. It's true. If all of us stand, we will break the charge of the charging horseman. And if all of us are well-informed voters, we may get good government. But if I'm a well-informed voter, that increases the chance of the good guy winning by a very, very small amount. In a presidential election, in my particular case, it has no effect at all because I live in California, and any election in which California goes Republican, they aren't going to need it, at least for the presidential. It'll be the last state, probably, maybe Massachusetts. But even if you think of a more random case, the chance of one vote deciding the American presidential election is probably somewhere around 1 in 5 million, roughly speaking. And that means that I am bearing all of the cost to get a very, very trivial benefit. Now, it's true that benefit is a benefit to 300 million Americans if I'm really doing it right, if it really is a case where we're voting for somebody who's good for everybody instead of bad for everybody. But I don't get the 500 million American votes. I only get my one 300 millionth part of it. So most of the benefit goes to other people, so most voters are rationally ignorant. And the ones who aren't are rationally well-informed because they are entertained by politics or because they like to argue with people. At least they think they're rationally well informed. Half of them believe one and half the other, so they can't all be well informed. If voters are rationally ignorant, they support policies that sound good to somebody who knows little about them and has no incentive to learn more, which gives you a politics, as I like to say, of sound bites and demagoguery. All right. Further implication of rational behavior in the political market is short political time horizons. One of the arguments you often hear made for government intervention is the market doesn't look far enough ahead. We've got to bear costs now in order to get benefits in the distant future. The incentive to bear costs now for benefits in the future depends on the person who bears the costs now getting the benefits later. However, a politician who does politically costly things now is providing a benefit to his successor 20 years later, by which time he is out of office and about half the time the other party is in office and gets to say, look, isn't the world wonderful? Vote for us again, and ignore the fact that it's wonderful because of something his predecessor of 20 years ago did. Now, it is true that politicians pretend to be interested in the future. The great thing about the future is that it's invisible, and therefore, if I tell you you should vote for me because the price of gas is low today, I look on the sign and I observe that gas is currently in California something absurd, $4 or $5 a gallon, so I don't believe you. But if you say you should vote for me in order that the price of gas will be lower in 10 years, well, I can't tell that that's a lie. You can't even tell that that's a lie. Right? So that means that you can use future benefits to persuade people to accept real costs now for imaginary benefits then. My favorite example of this is Joseph Stalin. He could not plausibly tell the inhabitants of Moscow who were living a family to a room that he was making life good for them. But he could for quite a while say, yes, these are the sufferings we have to put up with in order that our children will be richer than the Americans. Doesn't last forever. Eventually people stop believing you, but it worked for a while. But what politicians actually decide to do is judged by the effects on the next election. And if you read, if you pay attention to not the proclamations, but the stories and the polling and such, you discover that what the important question is, what will the inflation rate be at the next election? What will the unemployment rate will be at the next election? Because those are actually things that will affect whether you get elected or not. Let me give you a different example. Drug regulation. A regulator who makes the mistake of approving a drug which kills 20 people, visibly kills 20 people, is finished. A regulator who cautiously, prudentially, carefully delays the introduction of a drug, killing 100 people, people who would have lived with that drug and now die, pays no cost at all, because statistical deaths are invisible and voters are rationally ignorant. I like to point to the press release in which the FDA admitted, I'm trying to remember what the number was, but admitted to killing something like 100,000 people. Oddly enough, they didn't put it that way. This was over the approval of beta blockers, which are drugs that are used to prevent a second heart attack. They had been used in Europe by this time I think, for over a decade. And the FDA finally decided to approve it. And it announced that these drugs they had just approved would save, I don't know, it was something like 10,000 lives a year, which means that 100,000 people died because you waited 10 years to approve them, which is not how they put it for some odd reason. All right. What about income redistribution as it really occurs? Let's think about the case of tariffs. Those of you who happen to be economists may know that the economics of foreign trade were correctly worked out by a fellow called David Ricardo just a little over 200 years ago. He's a very impressive fellow, I should say, for anybody who is interested in such things, because David Ricardo succeeded in inventing general equilibrium theory with no mathematics beyond arithmetic, which is obviously impossible. I like to say that the modern economist reading Ricardo feels a little bit as if he was somebody who was approaching a modern mountain climber approaching the summit of Mount Everest, who was passed by a hiker in t-shirt and tennis shoes coming down. So let's think about the logic of tariffs. An auto tariff benefits car makers and their workers at the cost of consumers and farmers. The beneficiaries are a few firms and a union with a lot at stake. The losers are hundreds of millions of people, each losing a little. I should say that's not only buyers of cars, it's also farmers, because if we import less, we also export less. Again, one could work out the details, and I do, but not in this talk. The beneficiaries are a small number of players. From the standpoint of each beneficiary, from the standpoint of Ford Motors, the United Auto Workers, lobbying for a auto tariff is a public good. Public good for a very small public, namely consisting of the auto companies and the UAW. However, public goods can be privately produced, and in particular, a public good that is a good for a very small public can be privately produced by the people agreeing, by their saying, look, I'll chip in $1 million campaign contributions to the public-spirited representatives who vote for our tariff. If you'll chip in $1 million, and you, the UAW, will only chip in $500,000, but you'll tell all your people who to vote for. So they can do a pretty good job. If the auto tariff is worth $1 billion to them, they can probably raise at least $100 million in order to buy it. The losers, however, are several hundred million people, and there is no practical way they can coordinate. And in fact, if you look at the actual politics of tariffs, the people who are arguing against the tariffs are not the farmers, typically. They're not the consumers. They're the firms that sell foreign autos, because they are the only group concentrated enough to raise money for this purpose. All right. So it follows, this is an example of a general principle, which is that it is politically profitable to benefit concentrated interest groups with small numbers of players, at the cost of dispersed group, even if the cost is much larger than the benefit. Gary Becker drew one conclusion from this, which is that if you look at farm policy, the world is divided into two kinds of countries. Countries where the farmers are a small part of the population, such as the U.S. The purpose of farm policy is to push up the price of food in order to subsidize the farmers at the cost of the mass of the population. And places where farmers are a large part of the population, farm policy is designed to push down the price of food in order to buy the support of the urban mob at the cost of the dispersed farmers. This is probably a little oversimplified. I think New Zealand, last I looked, had neither subsidy nor had neither policy, but that's an exception. All right. Conclusion, that on the private market, individuals must usually pay for what they use and get paid for what they produce. If I want to use your labor as an input, I've got to offer you a wage you're willing to accept. If I want to use your grain to make flour, I've got to pay you a price at which you're willing to sell the grain to me. But there are sometimes exceptions where they don't. That's the pollution and public goods and such. So market failure sometimes occurs. On the political market, individuals almost never bear the costs or receive the benefits of their actions. They therefore have no incentive to make those choices that maximize the net benefit to all, except by random chance. It might happen that if you receive 1% of the benefit and pay 1% of the cost, then your incentives are exactly aligned. But that's not something one has any reason to count on. All right. And that explains why it is that the market failure theory does a better job of predicting political outcomes than of predicting market outcomes. Because after all, on the private market, it is clear from market failure theory, from public good theory, that radio and TV broadcasts were never produced except by government, because they're pure public goods, and yet they are. Externalities shouldn't be controlled, but often are. Compare a large shopping mall to a small town, which is cleaner and safer. In my experience, the shopping mall is. Maybe small towns are better in this country. On the public market, the economic argument for protective tariffs is out of date by just over 200 years, since theory of comparative advantage was correctly worked out by David Ricardo in, I don't know, I think he published before 1824, I think so. I think maybe 1820 or 1819 or something. And yet most countries have tariffs. Why? Because they benefit the concentrated interest at the cost of the dispersed customers. I actually have some notes on Gary Becker's point about farmers, which again is a case where the prediction of the theory correctly maps what happens, because the theory predicts that governments will do things to transfer from concentrated interest from dispersed interests to concentrated interests. Conclusion: market failure is an argument for government intervention in markets. It means that if you had a sufficiently competent and benevolent dictator, he could improve on the market outcome sometime. But it's a stronger argument against once one remembers to apply the same analysis to both, to think of each not in terms of an institution that does whatever you want it to do, but as an institution with predictable behavior based on private individuals seeking their own objectives. All right. Market failure is, however, relevant to lots of other things as well. For example, if you happen to be a general, you can try to take advantage of the other side's market failure. You can try to structure things. You want to make sure that the soldiers in that line you're charging have someplace to run. After all, if the enemy general lined them up just on the other side of a river and burnt the bridge across it, they're going to stand and meet your charge because it doesn't do any good to run. Well, that means that one guy may want to burn his bridges behind him. It's a high-risk strategy if he happens to lose the battle, but something to be said for it. And the other one is going to want to make sure that he sets things up so that there is what looks like a plausible exit for the individual soldiers on the other side. In running a firm, you want to design the firm in such a way that the reward to each individual corresponds to his contribution. That might mean that whereas you say, well, it seems as though I should have one guy at the top making all the decisions, maybe that's a mistake. Maybe you want to have 5 different divisions, each with its own person in charge of it, and some accounting mechanism by which you can tell which division is doing how well. And similar things, obviously, farther down the structure. I'm not having run firms. I can't tell you how to do this, but you can see the logic of the problem is exactly the same. I have, however, taught courses, and so one of the things you want to do is to find ways of getting the students to know whether or not they understand what you're doing. I imagine the following situation. I have just explained the principle of comparative advantage, and I then say, now, did everybody follow that? And each student says to himself, well, I actually didn't understand it, but maybe the other ones do, and I'll look really stupid if I say I didn't understand it. He might even give me a lower grade, because if he thinks I'm stupid, he'll interpret my exam answers unfavorably, and besides, the girl who I'm trying to go out with will think I'm an idiot and therefore won't go out with me. So everybody remains silent, and I only discover the mistake when I grade the exam. And I have a solution to this problem. I have to admit I'm a theorist, not an empiricist. I haven't actually implemented the solution. But my solution is that you arrange a classroom so that at every place there is a button that the student sitting there can unobtrusively push with his toe. And at the back of the classroom there's a sign showing how many buttons are pushed. And so I then say, well, everybody who thinks he clearly understands the principle of comparative advantage, push his button. And the number 2 appears on the screen at the back. They may be wrong, but they at least believe they understand it. and I go back and explain it again. So that would be an example of how this approach to thinking about human behavior would be relevant to my actual profession. What used to be my profession. I'm retired now. Furthermore, it's also relevant to how to run a household, which is something that I have been involved in as a participant in a jointly run household. Sometimes my wife cooks dinner, sometimes I do. Which of us should clean up? And I want to make it easier, and perhaps unrealistic, by assuming that each of us cooks dinner half the time. Nowadays, we have an adult daughter who often cooks dinner too, but I'll leave that out. But the more general issue is, if you have 2 or more people who are taking turns cooking dinner, which of them should clean up? And generally, when I ask this question, I get the right answer from people who actually cook dinners and not from people who don't. And the right answer, in my view, is that the person who cooks also cleans. I cook and clean one day, she cooks and cleans another. Why? Because the cook makes decisions that affect how much cleaning up is needed. So if someone else is going to do the cleaning up, well, you know, I mean, I've got 5 minutes while the water comes to a boil. Why should I spend those 5 minutes washing out the frying pan? I can leave that for my wife to do. In deciding what to do, there are some meals which can be done in a single pot. There are some meals that can be done in 4 or 5 pots. There are a whole lot of decisions of that sort. And not only, maybe love solves part of it. I actually care about my wife. But even if I perfectly care, even if I cared about her as much as myself, I don't get the feedback if she does the cleanup. Well, I might get the feedback, but in an unpleasant form. But basically, if I'm doing the cleanup, then it is brought to my immediate attention that having left the rice a little too long, I now have got to clean out the stuffed, burnt rice on the bottom of the pot. And that is also why we make small children clean up their own messes. It's clearly, at first glance, inefficient, because the time it takes you to get your kid to clean up the mess is several times as long as it would take to clean it up yourself. However, if you do it yourself every time, there is very little reason not to make messes. So the logic is the same. I said I would talk about how to make money. And one way of thinking about market failure is that it is a profit opportunity. That the fact that there is market failure implies that there is some other outcome that is on net an improvement. Some other things people could be doing. Well, an entrepreneur who figures out how to get that outcome, which you might not be able to do, but somebody did combine radio broadcasts with ads, that an entrepreneur who figures out how to do that outcome might end up pocketing some of that gain. For example, the first person who thought of combining advertisements, the first shopping center, or Google, which selling a search engine would never have worked. So they gave away a search engine and then sold the opportunity to be easy to find. Right? I have a story which I think of as a story about designing around market failure. And we imagine there are 2 Bedouins riding through the desert, and one of them is complaining very loudly about how slow his camel is. And the other one says, "You think your camel is slow? This snail, rock, I'm sitting on is slower still." The oasis is a mile away. And they start arguing. And eventually, they decide to bet that whichever Bedouin's camel gets to the oasis last is going to win the bet, because that'll be the slowest camel. So the first one goes slow, the second goes slower, and what happens? An hour later, there are 2 Bedouins sitting their camels in the middle of the Arabian desert, blazing hot, with the oasis still half a mile away. Wise man comes by, and he asks, "Why are you two idiots sitting here in the blazing sun in the middle of the desert with the oasis half a mile away?" And the Bedouins get off their camels to explain to him. And the wise man says 2 words, the Bedouins jump on camels and race to the oases. For anybody who hasn't heard this before, what are the 2 words? The bet is on the camels, not on the Bedouins. Let me say a little bit about the pandemic. It's not quite as hot news as when I last gave this talk, but still something some of us may still remember. It is true that there is a market failure problem if there are no rules, that I do not have the right incentive to take precautions against your getting the disease if I have it. If I do things that risk getting myself infected, I bear part of the cost because I'll the one who'll be sick, but I don't bear all of the cost because if I get infected, I might pass it to you, and that's a cost to you. If I do things that risk passing the infection, I bear almost none of the cost. All right? Therefore, it follows that my incentive to avoid both of those risks is inefficiently low, that I will be less careful than I would be if I took into account costs to other people as well as to me. But there still is an incentive because I don't want to get sick. All right? The government, which wants to step in to correct this problem, is farther from having the right incentives because I bear a large part of the cost of my having COVID. Mr. Fauci bears none of it. The government bears none of it, almost none of it. It might result in my paying fewer taxes this week or something. Similarly, the cost of the lockdown. The lockdown is not a cost for the governor of my state who was going to a fancy restaurant and got caught doing so while it was happening with a whole lot of other people. But it is a cost to people who were not permitted to go out of their houses. So there is less reason to expect the government to make the right choices than to expect the individual, even though the individual will also not make the right choices. And in fact, governments didn't. My examples are from my government. Your government doubtless committed different crimes than mine did. The vaccine, they make a big point of the fact that we got the vaccine in less than a year. The truth is that we got the vaccine in less than a week. That's how long it took to actually develop the first vaccine that worked. Most of a year was the time to get permission to distribute it. Now, it's true, it would also have taken time to build up the facilities, so it's not like you could have really had it in a week, but you could have had it in quite a lot less than a year. Part of the reason it took that long was that the government was not willing to do challenge trials. Let me explain that. Also, in the U.S. at least, the committee that approved it was not meeting on weekends. So that's an extra 2 days at the last stage of the process. How it was actually done. What they did was you give it to a few people. You test the dosage and see what the effects are. You then give it to hundreds of people, wait a few months to make sure it isn't dangerous. You then give it to tens of thousands of people, have tens of thousands more people as controls, and don't tell which of them have actually gotten the real vaccine. And you don't even know. That is, you have the information written down somewhere, but the people who are doing the experiment, who are finding out whether the vaccine works, this is a double-blind experiment, so the experimenters know half these people got the vaccine, the other half didn't, and in that envelope is the list of which are which, roughly speaking. All right? You then wait months to see how many of each group gets COVID. This takes a long time because most people don't get COVID. All right? It's only random exposure, even if they aren't vaccinated. This is a very sensible way of doing it if you have unlimited time. All right? Because it avoids the standard way of doing double-blind experiments. It avoids all sorts of problems of the experimenter bias messing things up. All right. However, how it could have been done. Give it to 1,000 volunteers, wait 6 weeks, observe that it is not very dangerous, and observe the antibody effect of various dosages. All right, so that's first stage, takes 6 weeks. Give it to a few hundred volunteers, none of them elderly, because by that time we knew that it was much more dangerous for elderly people than for young people, and deliberately expose them to COVID. This is what we call a challenge trial, in order to see if it actually works. All right, people who are deliberately exposed are very likely to get it. You presumably have some statistics on this from hospitals and such. So you know that if most of the people don't get it, then the vaccine works. Then, once you've observed that it substantially reduces the chance of getting it, make it available to anybody who's willing to provide later feedback. And that would save about 7 months, which for the U.S. would be about 100,000 to 200,000 deaths, many more abroad. The argument against it is that a few volunteers might have died in the testing. If you make sure that none of them are old, probably none of them will, but they might. You're playing safe at 2,000 deaths a day. All right. Precautions taken. There was a whole lot of attention given to surface transmission. I gather now there is a little evidence that surface transmission sometimes occurs, but there wasn't much and there still isn't very much. And it's pretty clearly been well established that transmission is almost entirely through the air. But we still get all sorts of instructions and restaurants telling you what all the good things they're doing and so forth. The results of lockdown are ambiguous. It's not clear whether lockdowns made it more or less likely to spread. Preventing large groups from gathering indoors reduced contagion. On the other hand, the lockdown pushes people indoors where contagion is much more likely than outside, which was a minus. And there were very large costs of the lockdown, namely students losing a year or two of education, the economy producing a good deal less, people's mental health, even some people dying. Masks might help. I think there is some evidence that masks help. However, the U.S. at least, they first announced they didn't work. The excuse later was they were trying to save them for the medical people. Then they announced they did work. And there was never much evidence on how effective they were. There was one mass trial in, I think, Bangladesh, which produced rather ambiguous evidence. And furthermore, a mask is not a mask is not a mask. I think I got one of these things in my pocket. It indeed probably does some good, but it does a whole lot less good than an N95. However, there was never any attempt, at least in the U.S., any serious attempt to get people, if they were required to wear masks, to wear good ones. And this is a whole lot better than a handkerchief over your nose or maybe just over your mouth, which is what a lot of the people who were required to wear masks were doing. So there was never any serious attempt to use the masks as a actual way of preventing it rather than a way of demonstrating that you were a good person who was doing what you were told. There were some ways in which they made things worse. Again, this is the U.S. The FDA only allowed the use of the COVID test that they had approved, although there were other tests being used abroad. And they eventually conceded that the test they approved of didn't work. In some states, New York is the famous example, long-term care facilities full of old people were required to accept infected patients in order to leave more room in the hospitals, although the hospitals, in fact, never ran out of room. What would a wise government have done? We don't really know. There's still a lot of uncertainty. But arguably, at least, what they would have done was a tight quarantine for old people, which is what we, in fact, did. At the point when it began looking to look as though COVID was serious, I was in fact in Europe on a speaking trip. My younger son emailed me arguing that I ought to come home. And my initial reaction is, why should I do that? I've never had any reason in the past. And then I thought about the difference between fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is figuring out a new problem. Crystallized intelligence is remembering your solution to the problem last time. And there is a pattern that the older you are, the more you rely on crystallized intelligence. And I decided that was what I was doing, and I flew home. Canceled my last 2 talks, I think, at least one of which I couldn't have given, as it turned out, because the Czechia closed the border the day before I was supposed to fly in there, though I didn't know that when I canceled the talk. Once I got home, I was 75, my wife 64, so I in particular were at serious risk. I believe that until the vaccine was available, I was more than 10 feet from our property, let me say, other than in a car only twice, and those occasions I was not interacting with anybody. That would have cost much less than the trillions the U.S. spent and would have eliminated most, although not all, of the deaths. Over 80% of the deaths were 65 plus, 95% were 50 plus. If everybody in the U.S. under 55 got COVID, that would have been 130,000 deaths instead of 600,000. Gives you a rough estimate. Now, I did those calculations a while back, and there's probably better data now. Also, that policy would have eliminated most of the costs of lockdown, because most of the people you were locking down were retired people who had still like to go outside but have less reason to than other people. So my conclusion is that freedom would have worked worse than perfect government regulation, better than what governments actually did. Leaving people free to choose does not always work perfectly, but it's usually better than the alternative, which is having someone else choose for them. For much more on these subjects, including lots of other talks of mine that have been recorded, my website is www.daviddfriedman.com. My Substack is what you see here. And I should say my website now, fairly recently, includes a search window. This was a suggestion by one of the commenters. I put the question to commenters on my Substack. Should I try to index this stuff? Which would have been a real pain. And somebody said, no, you should make it available for a search engine. And somebody else told me how to do it. And there is now a window on my webpage where you can type in words, and it will search through all of my blog posts, all of my Substack posts, and a large part of my other published written work to find any examples of those words. So I'm using Google essentially to do the work for me. And it's actually quite useful for me, because sometimes I say, well, didn't I discuss that subject somewhere? Now I can find out very quickly. Anyway, the Substack currently is coming out every 3 days. It covers a very wide variety of topics. My last 2 were on immigration, which is a very hot topic at the moment. My next one may be on the question of whether giving women the vote resulted in increased government expenditure, which was a conjecture that I got from my friend and colleague Gordon Tullock a very long time ago. And I try to look at what the evidence is, and evidence is pretty poor, and then having not gotten very good evidence, I speculate about why it might be true, which is the interesting question anyway. I'm a theorist, not an empiricist. And I think, not sure what my next one is going to be. I've got a couple that are ready to go. I try to, especially in a situation like this, to make sure that I've got a little bit. But I have a whole lot on climate issues. That's probably what I posted most on. And in fact, one of the ones that I've got ready to go is, does climate catastrophe pass the giggle test? That is the claim that we have good reason to expect catastrophic results from climate change, one that a reasonable person should take seriously. And I conclude it is not, but other people may disagree. But there have been a whole lot on climate, because I got interested in that subject a fair while back, and basically concluded that the IPCC's estimate of climate changes was probably not too bad, maybe as good as you can do, but that going from that, people were much too inclined to ignore positive effects and exaggerate negative effects, and therefore it was not at all clear whether the net effects of climate change are good or bad for human beings. Anyway, if you're curious about that, in addition to having the search window, I also have a link to all of my Substack posts sorted by topic. So you can find the 20 or 30 that are about climate that way. Anyway, so that's the relevant stuff. And I think that's it. And now you people get to ask me questions.
Thank you very much. Perhaps I could ask the first question, since I have already gotten in position of the mic. Maybe to follow up on what you said about climate change. That really is a collective action problem. It's a collective action problem in the extreme for the individuals, but also for governments.
Yes,
what's
correct.
your take on how to deal with that?
That what's actually happening is religious behavior. That is to say, as far as I can tell, the only rational politician in this is Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin sometimes says he doesn't believe in climate change. Mr. Putin can look at a map, and the map tells him that Russia will have a whole lot more usable land if the temperature of the globe goes up by 3 degrees. And I actually have a calculation on this. One of my Substack posts, I tried to do a rough estimate of the increase in the amount of land warm enough for people to live in as a result of 3 degrees of global warming. And I concluded that it increased the amount of such land available to humans by about the area of the United States. And of course, a lot of that is in Russia. Some of it is in Scandinavia, a lot of it is in Canada. But Canada goes to a whole lot of trouble to try to keep itself from growing, which is just crazy. So I think your point about governments is correct. That is to say, if climate change really were a catastrophic threat, it's not clear we could do anything about it, because at the individual level it's a public good problem, and at the government level it's a public good problem. And if all the countries were acting in their own interest, Canada would be pumping out all the CO2 they could, at least until India bombed them or something. But I think if you actually look at it, that it is clear that there are large positive effects. It is clear there are large negative effects, and it is not clear which are larger. And I should say I got into all of this 50 years ago, before climate change was an issue, because it was the same problem with population growth that people may have forgotten. But population growth about 50 years ago, maybe a little more than that, had exactly the same role in the public discourse that climate change does now. It was the impending threat that we had to do something drastic to protect ourselves against. And it didn't happen. That is to say, the population growth happened. In particular, poor countries were supposed to get much poorer and hungrier if they let their populations grow. Poor countries did let their populations grow. Rich countries mostly didn't. And the average calories per capita went up instead of down. The percentage of the population which was very, very poor went sharply down, precisely the opposite of the production. And I had an article back when this was happening, back again about 50 years ago. I wrote an article, my first real economics article, entitled Laissez-faire in Population, the Least Bad Solution, in which I made the same kind of argument I'm making now, that I tried to estimate costs and positive and negative externalities from having an extra kid, and concluded that I could not sign the sum, that there were both positive and negative effects, and one couldn't estimate them accurately enough to know which was larger. Anyway.
Thank you. I guess the population issue is still hot, but now it's the decline in population that's right. The great threat.
Correct.
Questions?
Thank you. Should I stand up?
At least present yourself.
Yes. My name is Martin Osvald. I'm from Odsherred in Denmark. I speak American, but I'm as Danish as apple pie. I would like to ask you, I understand, I think, all that you explained here about market failure. I would like to solicit your comment on might there be other mechanisms related to, say, ethics or morality or just the way humans are, which can also play a role in regulating behavior in such a way that, in some cases, maybe the common good is still favored by democracy and other.
Yeah, that is possible in the sense that, well, a lot of it, unfortunately, is random error. That is to say, if people are not acting in their rational self-interest, they might be doing so in a way which indeed solves such problems. They might be doing so in ways that create such problems. Burning witches, for example, which was a religious result of various religious tendencies in basically 17th, maybe into the 18th century. But yeah, no, the climate change is an interesting case because I was sarcastically saying that what was happening was religious. That is to say that what's happening is that ignorant voters in Canada believe that terrible things are going to happen to the world if we don't prevent climate change, and are therefore willing to support policies similarly for ignorant voters in California, which is one of the particularly stupid states in this respect. If it really were catastrophic, that would be fortunate. All right, so if you think of it as environmentalism as a religion, it might have good effects, it might have bad effects, depending on whether the religious impulse was pushing you to make things better or worse, and could do both. So certainly it's possible. I don't think I have a good enough theory of norms or of religions to say whether you can predictably set things up in some way such that they'll do good things. Another question? But it's an interesting question, I agree.
Hi, Mr. Friedman. I'm Louis, and I'm 15 years old. And my question is going to be about rational egoism. As far as I understand, you argue for rational egoism, that people will always do what's in their best self-interest.
That's a great exaggeration. No, I would say that is a better way of predicting what people will do than any other alternative we have. But in fact, I observe that when there is a bowl full of potato chips close to me, it mysteriously empties itself, even when I'm overweight. So I would say that human beings are not perfectly rational, but that they are rational enough, and we are sufficiently short of good explanations of irrational behavior, so that assuming they are rational is often the best you can do in terms of predicting.
Okay, so you don't agree with Dostoevsky, for example, who explains in the novel Notes from the Underground that he doesn't believe in rational egoism, and that people will not be reasonable, but will try to exert their free will instead of being reasonable.
I would have said that what I do with my free will is to try to be reasonable.
Okay.
And I haven't read that novel, and so I can't tell if you are correctly representing Dostoevsky's position or not.
Hi, my name is Henrik. I have a question regarding to which degree you believe that what the capacity for culture and social norms is to mitigate the problems of market failure. For example, if you're talking about the ultimatum game, like a classical macroeconomic situation, you do see, like, when you study it empirically, that people are willing to bear some cost in order to enforce a social norm or punish what they see as an unfair offer. And I think the reason for that is probably to some extent that they have been instilled with the values that they now feel are being threatened, so they're willing to bear some cost to defend them.
That's one possibility. A different possibility is that you're observing a commitment strategy, that essentially making myself somebody who, if you think about bilateral monopoly bargaining, which is the kind of context you're talking about, we've got $1 to divide between us. Making myself someone who will feel terrible about receiving less than 50% if I can make myself that kind of person and you can observe the fact that I have, it is then I am better off doing that. That in general, a lot of what you're describing, I think, can be explained by commitment strategies in which I have a discussion in a couple of my books on economics of virtue and vice, in which I'm explaining the virtuous behavior as a commitment strategy to treat well people you're having voluntary interactions with, because it is worth more to have a voluntary interaction with somebody who will treat you well. That's it. Yeah.
Certainly, but what about if you consider a situation where a parent might choose to care for their children, even though
Yes.
the benefit for that care might not be realized until like sufficiently many decades later, where the parent presumably is sadly dead? They would still presumably care for the children, even though there is no rational incentive to it.
I don't
in the same
understand.
sense
There isn't a rational reason why you have objectives. The claim is that you rationally seek your objectives. In this particular case, you've been brainwashed by your genes, which have had a very long period of time to craft people in such a way that they will take care of their children, because the people who didn't aren't around, or at least their descendants aren't around. So I would have said that it isn't a conflict with rationality if I have objectives other than maximizing my income. Income is only useful for buying stuff anyway.
Certainly, but this is my conclusion. What if you've been brainwashed by society to care for society and care for the good of people among us? To what extent does that mitigate market failure?
I guess I would have said that my casual empirical evidence is that people are not sufficiently brainwashed to care about society to actually make any serious effort to find out what's in the good of society. That the behavior looks much more as though they have been brainwashed by their genes to try to behave in ways that will make the people that they care about think well of them, and are therefore conforming to the appearance of behaving well in with regard to society, but that can result in the opposite behaviors according to to what the views are of the people that are around them. There's some very interesting research by Dan Kahan at Yale on people believing things, and he looks at issues which have become group membership markers, things like whether you believe in the theory of evolution. And his conclusion from evidence is that the more intellectually able you are, the more likely you are to agree with your group's views, whether that means believing in evolution or not believing in evolution. So I think that probably is a more plausible explanation of the behavior you're describing. But these are certainly interesting questions. I mean,
Thank you. I have a conflict in my mind. Is with the modern societies we have democracy in many developed countries, and it seems to work well. Like economy has grown in the last 100 years. Democracy seems to be a good thing, but could it also result in market failure? With the democracy system is designed that we make our vote, and then we give some of our power and right for the government to decide for us. That could end up having bigger cost than benefits it brings, and that's just a conflict to me.
Yeah, that is, democracy is not a very good way of running governments. I just don't think we have a very good way of running governments. And I think you would have to know what the alternative is. The most successful economy of the 20th century was not democratic. The most successful economy was Hong Kong. And it was a British Crown colony. And it happened to have the very good luck to be run by a British servant who was very much behind the times, and therefore ran it in a more nearly classical liberal kind of way. But that's luck, and you can't guarantee that'll happen. So I don't know whether democracy is the least bad way of running. You know, there's this famous quote by Winston Churchill that democracy is the worst form of government ever invented by the mind of man, except for all of the others. And that's usually interpreted as a defense of democracy, but it could also be seen as a criticism of government. It says there are no good ways of running government. And of course, my solution is that I don't believe in government. Yeah. That is that my view is that in some but not all not all circumstances, but in some circumstances, you can have a functioning society in which all of the useful things governments do are done by private mechanisms. And I've got at least arguments to suggest that that society will generate reasonably good system of laws.
Could I try to challenge
Sure.
you a little bit? How much, if you are in a relatively successful democracy,
Yes.
you might say Denmark is that, compared at least to to most other countries, how much government would you be willing to risk taking away as an alternative to keeping a very imperfect the democracy, but perhaps not as
I'm not
bad
sure
as
if I
it could
understand
be?
the question. If you're asking me how much government I am reasonably confident you could take it away, I would say getting down to at least the level of the U.S. and the U.K. in the 19th century, and probably a bit below that. That I think, but it also depends on the country. So that if you're Estonia or Latvia, you have to worry about the fact that you've got a very large and unfriendly neighbor. The U.S. doesn't. The U.S. talks a lot about national defense, but no, the only two countries that can invade us are Canada and Mexico, right? And neither of them is really a very likely threat. So I would have thought that a stateless society is much more plausible for a country which does not have serious external threats, because national defense is a public good, and it's not impossible to produce it privately, but it's hard. And for countries that have a lot of serious threats, that probably the optimal level of government is higher. That, the argument I'm making is that, generally speaking, shifting things from private market to government decision is likely to increase market failure. But if you happen to have a particular case where the market failure is enormous already in the private one, then maybe the public one is less bad.
Niels Thygesen, University of Copenhagen. Professor Friedman, you expressed admiration for what David Ricardo taught us in 1817, in fact, in his book about comparative advantage.
Yeah.
But one problem today is that comparative advantage can be created by countries, and it can be lost. It has to be defended sometimes. And that comes back to your question on the tariffs.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean. How that is, you can create comparative advantage very easily if you deliberately destroy your agriculture industry. That's creating comparative advantage for importing farm goods and exporting something else.
I'm not going back to that example of Ricardo's. I'm thinking of a more topical one on the imbalance of international trade, where some countries are creating comparative advantages at a fast pace. And you said
I don't understand what you mean. Do you think a comparative advantage means something that results in gold flowing into your country?
I'm saying that if you look at the market for electric vehicles, for example, China has, through a massive subsidies program, built up an industry that can not only threaten competition in the short run,
but that means that they're lowering their comparative advantage in agriculture.
They are, but I mean, it's a long-term decision. You dismiss tariffs as an action that would be at all defensible in that context in the United States or in Europe, wherever.
Yes, I don't think I understand your argument, and I'm not even sure I understand how you're using comparative advantage. Comparative advantage is the fact that the ratio of costs for two different goods is different in different countries, and therefore each country can gain by exporting the one for which their cost is relatively lower and importing the one for which their cost is relatively higher, and that is not.
But what happens if one government subsidizes its costs?
In that case, the result is that it's giving a gift to the countries that it's exporting to.
You are certainly right that the benefits to those who would buy the cheaper goods in the United States are larger than those lost in the short term. But there is a strategic point that you might lose that kind of industry altogether.
You might.
It's a long-term consideration which only governments can make. It's not a market decision. It cannot be left to the market.
I'm afraid I do not understand the argument that you're offering. If China subsidizes its EV market, And the result is that for the next 20 years, we buy our cars from them. If they decide at the end of 20 years to start subsidizing it and start taxing it and try to exploit us, we'll build our EV industry now. After all, China has been in exactly the situation of starting out with not having industries and then building them.
You mentioned some of the, Ulrich, I work here. You mentioned some of the, some of the market failures in the political market, but can't you iterate on some of the democratic institutions to at least like diminish it somewhat? I'm thinking something like direct referendums a la Switzerland, or let's say more decentralized government, and then by increasing the cost of lobbyism and so on.
Yep.
Aren't there a lot of ways we can still at least reduce the
more decentralized government
failures?
is the most attractive of those approaches, I think. That is to say, if the decisions are being made for a group of 100 people, it is much more likely that those 100 people actually know something about the relevant issue, and there is still a public good problem. They've got more of an incentive to get informed, because each of them believes that with 100 voters, his vote might well decide it. So that's an argument for, so far as possible, decentralizing government.
Jonas Herby from CEPOS. Thank you for a great speech, and I very much agree with you. But what are we going to do about it? I mean, we have a big government in Denmark, and it's I don't find it that easy to make it small.
That is what you do. What you do is to try to persuade what you do is to try to persuade people that they ought to have a smaller government, or else you could migrate to some place that has a smaller government. You know, if we're very lucky, Argentina might look great in 10 years. But I'm not counting on it. I'm not moving there yet. I haven't even started learning Spanish.
Thank you. I agree perfectly that we have much too much government here, and I think it would be fine if we came down to the level we had, maybe not in year 1900, but maybe 1950 or something like that, which would be less than 20% of what we got now here in Denmark. My question is this. Could you give us some designs to get some liberal market economy mechanism in play to bring down that number? The way it works now is that publicly employed people are bundling their presence for no purpose at all with small bits of necessary things that they have to do. So we pay for people where maybe 5% of what they do is actually necessary, and the remaining 95% is just pastime. Mm. Could you give us an idea to a mechanism to bring that to a halt?
Well, my elder son argued that the kind of arguments I make are not very useful because, in fact, governments won't follow them, and that the right solution is to set up a system of competitive governments. And his idea was seasteading. His idea was, if you can develop a technology of floating housing, you can then say, all right, here are a bunch of people living on giant rafts, basically. They're clustered, they're a town, they have agreed on some rules, and if it turns out that the rules end up changing in ways you don't like, you just hire a tugboat and you pull your raft out of the cluster, and you find some other people who agree with you on how it should be done, and you set up another cluster. And I think that approach, that technology probably won't work, although one can hope, but the general approach of asking what are the dynamics that will or will not create a better outcome is a useful approach. And you would like to find ways of making governments more having to compete for taxpayers, making taxpayers more mobile. I don't know if you ever read C. Northcote Parkinson, a British, you know him. Anyway, 60 years ago, yeah. A British writer who was very good at making humorous essays arguing for serious arguments. And one of them, he comments that, I this is roughly a quote, and it was too optimistic in the numbers, but the productive people of the world have learned by long and bitter experience that they will usually have to pay about 10% of their income to some gangster feudal lord or Department of Revenue. It matters little what you call it. When the rates get higher than that, the Israelites start looking at the atlas. There are probably better places to be than Egypt. Now, his 10%, unfortunately, was too optimistic. But I think it is true that if you want to think about mechanisms for solving this problem, you want to think about ways of getting governments to have to compete with each other. And in a sense, the EU potentially is that, maybe becoming less so as it becomes more the United States of Europe and less a trade coalition. But to the extent that you have a situation where people in the EU are free to live in any country, that is going to put some pressure on countries to compete with each other in how good places they make to live. I've argued that one of the standard arguments in the U.S. against free migration is that because we have a welfare system, people will come to collect welfare. There's some truth to that, but of course the flip side of that is that people doing that reduces the political support for welfare systems. And you therefore want to think as best you can about how you can change the dynamics of the system, whether in Patri's solution of floating housing or by making it able to move around in ways that force governments to compete for taxpayers.
Could I ask you just a follow-up on that? How much role do you see for ideas in political change?
How much what?
Role do you see for ideas driving political change versus incentives, like the ones we've just been discussing? Is if incentives are so important, is there a role for ideas?
I think the answer is that the ideas that ignorant voters vote on free information. Free information is not necessarily true. So if you can cultivate a culture where people take it for granted that a producer is entitled to what he produces, it then becomes more politically costly to pass laws which take money from one person to give it to another. Not impossible, more costly. Similarly in a bunch of other ways. So I think that the ideas affect the environment of free information within which the political game is being played, and that affects costs. So that one of the Substack posts I haven't finished yet is How to Save the World, but I do have a draft on it. And if you think about it, how you change that depends on you. If you happen to be a really talented novelist, you write novels in which you illustrate the point. Ayn Rand would be the obvious modern example. George Bernard Shaw in the other direction would be an older example. And similarly for a movie maker, if you are if you're writing textbooks, you can write textbooks which convey true free information. But in general, that people are going to vote in terms of what they believe is good, and you can affect that by doing a variety of things. If you're an entrepreneur, you might be able to create a firm that produces something government produces in higher quality at low cost. Education would be an obvious target there.
What about crisis? You could perhaps see a crisis as a kind of free information to ignorant voters. If they suddenly see, for instance, inflation going up a lot, that might persuade somebody to change their own.
It might. So. But of course, then the other side will say it's only due to the greedy firms that are raising their prices. They obviously weren't greedy last year.
I have another question. So as far as I understand, you're politically in favor of not having a government at all, political theory anarchy, not using that as an insult. I'm sympathetic to the
proprietarian anarchy. That is a system of private property without a government.
Yeah, I'm personally very sympathetic to the idea, but I'm not convinced that it's a stable state for society. So my question is, like, what do you propose makes let's say you reached a state of anarchy in Denmark by working hard for it and convincing people. What keeps it that way? Because societies all across the world, like humanity started off without a state, but across the globe there are states. They seem to naturally occur as people like gather power. Charles Tilly describes it. Yeah, Charles Tilly describes it as a robber barons essentially consolidating. How do you prevent that from happening again?
I think whether it I don't think of it as my preventing it. I don't have the power. Whether it happens is going to depend on characteristics of the society. That the two ways in which it seems to me that a anarcho-capitalist society might be unstable. One of them is foreign aggression because of the public good problem, and the other is cartelization. That if you had a situation where you have private firms that are providing the service of rights enforcement and arranging to settle disputes, if there are a very small number of such firms, it might occur to them that it would be more profitable to go over to converting themselves in effect to a government. So that you say, there are only 3 of us, we get together, we agree we won't take your customers if they leave you, you won't take our customers if they leave us, now we have monopolies. And that's going to depend ultimately on economies of scale in the business of rights enforcement, also on the size of the market. Those are the two things that are going to determine how competitive the market is. So I think if you end up with 100 rights enforcement agencies, it's going to be very hard. If you end up with 3, there's a real danger.
All right, I think we can just one last question.
That was very interesting with the raft solution to bringing down too much government. We're discussing currently another approach to the problem here in Denmark in political circles. The idea is that what we're doing wrong, and which has allowed all these public servants to come into play, is that we have organized the execution of law incorrectly. We have good laws, we think, although there are too many of them. But we're talking about maybe we should start executing the laws in a different way.
I don't understand what that means.
Well, that would mean, for an example, let me give you a very specific example. We have ministries, as we call them, with a minister that takes charge of justice, someone takes care of public health, someone takes care of nature, and so on and so on and so on. And within them, they're organized like hierarchical firms, if you can imagine that. Now, we're talking about perhaps we should organize the body, the organization that executes law, that makes law happen. We should organize that differently. The way we traditionally organize public administration is incorrect.
So what's the correct way?
Well, for an example, this problem with too many words in the laws, if you had one public body or one ministry that went across all the traditional ministries in which said, these are the laws we're going to have, and they controlled the amount of laws, considered there was not too much rubbish in them. Perhaps that would work better than what we have now, where we have 30 different ministries that each control their own laws.
Yeah, but then the counter argument presumably is the argument for specialization, that the laws on one subject are being done by a ministry that's expert on that subject, and your ministry is generalists and therefore don't know. But anyway, I really don't have opinions on this sort of question.
Okay, this is going to be our last question, unfortunately. But David Friedman, thank you very much.